But we want to turn to another critically important story with very serious implications all around the globe, certainly, but absolutely for the African continent. That is the issue of debt, and certainly the issues that arise from that, especially debt cancellation and other policies that can address some of these issues. And as we turn to that story, we are very happy to be joined by Tim Jones, who's the head of policy at Debt Justice in the United Kingdom. Mr. Jones, thank you so much for being with us.
Hey, it's great to be with you.
Well, great to have you here. And Financial Times this morning actually had a article that put out into the world a lot of what you all have been saying quite a bit in terms of who really holds Africa's debt, where is the vast majority of debt held. So I don't want to bury the lead here, but if you could just talk to us a little bit about the research you all have been able to do into this question of the debt crisis in Africa and who is really holding the majority of this debt and what that says about the overall contours of the question.
Yes, so the biggest problem debt for many countries is that owed to private lenders. These are things like big banks, asset managers like BlackRock, hedge funds, who both are owed a lot of debt. So with the highest interest debt, they've tended to charge interest rates of between 7 and 10% of governments at a time when countries like the US or the UK have to borrow at less than 1%. So this has created a huge debt burden for countries that they've been struggling to pay. And then over the last few years, the impact of the pandemic and now the rise in food and energy prices across the world has really hit countries hard. And so many, when they should be using scarce resources to help their people, are having to spend large amounts in debt these kinds of lenders.
It's actually really incredible because we're just flooded with this propaganda, especially as things heat up between the US and China, about how it's China that's putting all of these African countries in these debt traps, and China is so predatory. But of course, this report shows that it's actually, I'm just going to read straight from it, just 12% of African governments' external debt is owed to Chinese lenders, compared to 35% owed to Western private lenders, which you just basically described. And more importantly, the Western lenders are charging double the interest as those as China. And if I'm not mistaken, China did actually forgive several interest-free loans, I believe, recently. But my question here is, how is it possible that we're hearing that these Western countries, particularly the U.S., which has a huge stranglehold over organizations like the IMF, and then obviously the lenders that you just mentioned, like BlackRock, how is it that they can get away with making this argument when the facts just suggest the complete opposite?
Yes, it's not to say that there isn't an important lender. 12% is still a reasonable amount, and in some countries it's others it's less. But as you say, there has been propaganda from Western governments that have wanted to pin all the blame for the debt crisis on lenders they have no responsibility for, China, and ignore the lenders that they do have responsibility for, the Western banks, the Western companies, and also the Western-controlled institutions like the International Monetary Fund, which themselves and the World Bank are also one of the big lenders. And then that has also been lapped up by many media organizations that just love to play into this geopolitical battle. And it's just extremely outrageous that this issue that's so important of the huge debt payments that countries are facing and the need to tackle that has become another geopolitical battle between the West and China, rather than everyone coming to it with goodwill and saying, how do we resolve this for the best?
I think that's such a good point, because it feels like, in a way, I almost am like flashing back to, 2008 and the bank bailouts. And they were like, well, those of us crying in the wilderness saying, don't bail out these banks. And, the discourse around moral hazard, and then they bail out the banks anyway, too big to fail, all these other things. And it just seems that there's a similar conversation now where it's almost just like, well, these profligate Africans, they borrowed all this money. They shouldn't have borrowed the money. It's unfortunate they can't pay it back. And I was hoping you could just talk about that framing, because I feel like we never really get to the key issues, some of which you already outlined, which is, how do we actually help people in these countries? It just always seems like such a moralizing discourse about Africa, and that anything that's done to address debt should somehow be punishing them in some way, for their profligate so-called activities.
Yeah. The narrative, and this we see in all kinds of debt, is that when debt is a problem, all the focus is put on the debtor and on the lenders. And it takes two to tango. And the lenders are as responsible for creating debt problems as any borrower. But then also you've got to unpack who the borrower is. The governments that are signing the loan, and often very cash constrained governments that have huge pressures on them, that therefore just have to rely on borrowing, but also not necessarily the citizens of that country having control over that process, but they're the ones who have to deal with the consequences of the debt. So it's both a lot more complex, but also just a lot more simple in thinking about the power dynamics, that the lenders are driven by this. They're seeking to make money on the side of the private lenders, or they're seeking to forward certain geopolitical goals in terms of government lenders and international institutions. But then when problems arise, they just want all the focus to go on who is to blame is the governments, and to dissolve themselves of responsibility. And so we think it's our job as campaigners on debt, so Debt Justice in the UK, campaigners we work with around the world, to put a focus on the lenders and on the structural reasons why debt has become a problem. Why are countries so dependent on borrowing in the first place? What are the roots of that in colonialism, in racism, that we need to challenge to?
Yeah, it was quite striking to see in this report that even the IMF and World Bank are basically calling on governments like in the US and the UK to basically step in to stop these private lenders from blocking debt relief. And it's not, it's not usual, it's not typical that you'll see the IMF and World Bank make such calls like that a state should step in to regulate private industry in any way whatsoever. It's usually the opposite that they'll be calling for. So that's quite striking. But this speaks to a broader issue. I mean, there have been calls from various organizations in the past to just forgive the debt, for just basic debt relief altogether. I mean, is there a broader call for this? Is there any momentum for this, for debts to these countries? And you talk about some of the root causes of this. I mean, some of these countries are just in perpetual debt from the 70s and 80s. It's just never stopped since then, since post-colonialism. But is there any momentum towards that for calling for just get rid of the debt altogether?
We're trying to create that momentum in calling for the cancellation of debt, and there are many groups around the world that are doing the same. But then it's also useful to see the context where that is kind of being negotiated happening right now. It's not just an abstract concept. So Zambia at the moment is trying to negotiate a large amount of its debt being cancelled from some of the private lenders and from China. Ghana has just launched the same. And actually, while we as allies in the global north and as the campaigners in the global south are trying to push for that and support that cancellation, also governments do have some power in this process as well. So both Zambia and Ghana have stopped paying the private lenders, have stopped paying China. And this is really, that's useful and powerful, and we need to stand in solidarity with that and say this is a good thing that they've stopped paying, and that means they can now use that money to help support their people and their economies. And if the private lenders refuse to cancel the debt, then they should just keep not paying them. And so it's not that debt cancellation has to be this thing that is granted from the powerful somewhere in the world. It's also something that we can try and create the space for debtors to do themselves, to stop paying and support them in that. Now, there's many things that could be done to help, and one of the key things, and that you alluded to with the calls by the IMF and the World Bank, is that these debt contracts are all governed either by law in New York or law in the UK. And one of the things that we could do specifically in New York and the UK is to change the law to make it easier for governments to get their debts cancelled from private lenders. And that's something actually the IMF and World Bank have hinted that they support. They've said it sometimes. And we've got clear proposals about how that could be done.
I think that's such an important point. It does speak to, one other element of how we move forward here is to what extent do we also need to change the framework of support that comes to these countries? I mean, I remember, when we had the Paris Club issue and the highly indebted poor countries debt relief, and then next thing you know, you've got all these countries, even more in hock to these banks. And it just feels like there's also a discourse and a conversation here about the responsibility of countries in the global north that have created this underdevelopment to also start offering more support that isn't just loans or money that has to be paid back, that there's sort of a reparatory element to this as well.
Yes, so we definitely need to see reparations in a monetary form, but we also need to see them in a way that the system is changed. So cancelling debt by itself kind of can help in the immediacy and in dealing with the crisis. But if other things don't change, we'll just end up back in the same crisis again and again. So those changes that we need to see include changing the trade system so that it's fairer, there are fairer trade processes, tackling the climate crisis and emergency, regulating the financial system to stop there being such large flows of money around the world and boom and bust. So there's huge structural changes that are needed as well as there is a financial responsibility for grants to be paid from the wealthier countries to help those in the global south.
And for those who are watching, I mean, what can people do to, help in this attempt to try to move towards some sort of debt cancellation, debt forgiveness?
Yeah, so there are groups around the world that are part of our global movement to debt and change the system. So in the UK, we've got Debt Justice. So you go to our website, debtjustice.org.uk. In the US, there are some of our international allies like Oxfam, but there's also Jubilee USA, who you can contact, and they work across the US. There's also specifically in New York Communities for Change have been working on the need for legislation in New York. And if there's listeners in other countries around the world, there's various groups that you can get involved in.
Well, Tim, we really appreciate you joining us. Very illuminating report on Africa. Really appreciate all the work that you are doing and for you giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Great to be with you.